Hello world, I'm John Bruni and you're listening to STRATEGIKON, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. From the beginning of the COVID-19 global pandemic, the world has changed in highly significant ways. International travel has been sharply curtailed, affecting the multi-billion-dollar travel and tourism industries. Social distancing and lockdowns have disrupted the daily life of millions of people, while millions have also died as a consequence of this disease, putting enormous stresses on the families which have suffered loss as a consequence of COVID-19. Uncertainty regarding national vaccine rollout programs persist, with many exercising their democratic right to refuse the administration of vaccines, jeopardizing the whole idea of gaining herd immunity. But who is to blame for this human misery and suffering? Well, under the Trump administration, the finger was squarely pointed at the People's Republic of China. After all, the pandemic came out of China allegedly as a zoonotic disease from the consumption of wildlife such as bats and pangolins. But the city of Wuhan, ground zero for the pandemic, is also where a Chinese biological research laboratory exists, leading to speculation that perhaps COVID-19 came about either as a deliberate or accidental release of the virus. With allegations of a deliberate or accidental release of COVID-19 on an unsuspecting Chinese and global population still circulating in the international media, tonight from Canberra, we are joined by Professor Sascha-Dominik of Bachmann from the University of Canberra to discuss this rather controversial view. Sascha, welcome to The Focus.
Thank you very much, John, for having me. Great to be with you.
Sascha, there's been a lot of talk, basically since the whole COVID-19 started, that the virus leaked from a lab in Wuhan, the known epicenter of the pandemic. The story has been kicking around since COVID's early days. Why has it persisted? And is it all about politics?
That's a very good question. Very early last year, already 2020 in April, I published a couple of pieces with American, mostly military journals, and they basically, the collaborators and I already looked at this sort of whether it could have been a bioweapon which accidentally escaped the lab. And we made it clear, we stated explicitly that that there's little evidence that it was developed as a biological weapon for offensive purposes. So when it comes to weaponization, I think what we did and what I want to do is actually move away from the use of now the virus as a weapon, bioweapon, because I think we will never know, and we don't want to use circumstantial evidence. But what we then did from then onwards was to look at, and this is what you mentioned with the political dimension, so to speak, of how the whole COVID and the COVID pandemic response was then weaponized by the CCP. So we basically, in order to avoid any sort of making any sort of calls which could be misread and misunderstood, we basically looked at that as an accident, an accidental escape from the lab. That is what our understanding was. And obviously we were very much a minority. And if we go back in time and if we look at how the scientific community and also the academic community tried to avoid any reference to bioweapon and lab, going instead into that meat market theory, and that obviously is much more basically forgivable. It is good to know now that basically we are now back into this discussion of what happened if that was, for example, you can say a bio accident out of the lab. And I think that's very important that when we talk about bioweapons, we have to bear in mind that this time we have 17 nations in the world doing such basically research which could qualify as bioweapon research. And most of these basically research undertakings are defensive. I mean, like, for example, when we had our Russian attack on a British soul in Salisbury, Salisbury has capabilities there. And these capabilities are part of what a military has to basically be prepared. It doesn't mean that, for example, the UK will now develop weapons for offensive purpose, but you have to have the capability to identify, for example, such bioweapons and then basically to react. And that is basically what I sort of, when we speak about bioweapon, we speak about the lab, I think we should bear that in mind. So there is, in my opinion, no evidence that that was developed as an offensive weapon. However, I think it is fair to say that the chance that the evidence will indicate that it was something what escaped, which is basically a bio accident. And that is the point of departure. And from that point onwards, we then looked at, we published 5 recognized peer-reviewed articles on the subject, basically how that then was weaponized in the post-COVID, you can say, day one. And that is basically the focus of it, the weaponization of the pandemic to reach basic strategic objectives.
David?
I'm glad that someone's talking about the fact that the release was accidental, but then it was, how do we make best advantage of this? Because from my perspective, when you look at how fast China starts probing along the China-India border, when they should have been focused on doing something to manage a virus, they were infinitely more focused on strategic advantage. So, and I guess that's part of the reason why people want to see a smoking gun, because of the callousness of going, this virus is loose, big deal. There's a strategic advantage here. And this is, I think, why it's important that the scientists talk about the science, the doctors talk about saving lives, but it's been very hard for strategists to legitimately talk about this without being seen as, the crazy fringe.
Totally agree, David, with you on that one. You mentioned the clashes along the line of control here with India. I think we also have to see that at the same time, the PLM stepped up its basically incursions into the EEZ, for example, of Vietnam. So basically, you can say increasing the activities. And that took place before the backdrop, and that is quite also noteworthy. I'm referring now to something what I wrote here for a Vietnamese newspaper in end of April 2020, that was actually a month when the news came out that the US Navy was heavily impacted in terms of its operational capabilities because of COVID on their ships. And if you now, for example, add to it Taiwan, and we are not out of the woods there yet, then you can say the callousness of exploiting basically this sort of vulnerability, the effect on the operation capabilities, in order then to stress their own basic capabilities and actually use them. That is what is callous. That is what is worrisome.
There is one thing, though. I mean, the Chinese seem to be getting back to business again. Their exports are ramping up. This is all the stuff that we get from the media. But I think that there might be two stories here, because if the rest of the world, especially, the West, is suffering under COVID, and if we're looking at India at the moment, we can't even, I don't think there's a proper adjective with what's going on over there. It's just a horror story. How likely is China to have fully recuperated from the outbreak of COVID within the CCP territorial bounds?
David, do you want to go first?
I'll happily jump in. I don't actually think China's recovered. And part of my reason for saying that is every time I look to see, is stuff being delivered worldwide on time? The answer is no.
Yeah.
So it appears to me that the best I can guess, production in China hasn't got much above 50%. And they are arguing that is because they're doing all the correct and safe things of limiting how many workstations in factories can have people on at a single time, blah, 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 blah. But the reality is you don't do that unless it's wreaking havoc.
Yeah. Which then leads us to the next, I'm sorry, Sasha, it also leads us to the next thing, and that is, we can talk about how COVID has had an impact on the military readiness levels of, say, the US Navy or other parts of, in India's armed forces. But obviously, it must have also had an impact on the PLA as well. I doubt that they came out of this unscathed.
I think, John, that is, David already, I share David's assessment. And we must never forget, that is a totalitarian regime. And this is all about basically smoke and mirror. So we will never, ever get any basic sort of data which we can basically verify. I just want to quickly go back into time a little bit. The Spanish flu, which was also a COVID, I think from the COVID family, it started in 1918. And there was a complete blackout because it was March 1918, the Germans launched the last offensive. And to talk about a super flu, that was absolutely something that was absolutely off the books. So to go back to whether for example, PLA is affected, I think we will never get any basic information in that regard unless we are working in a certain different, basically, employment.
Well, I think we have some of the information already, in that when John and I were doing interviews in Canberra in October 2019 with diplomats, weird questions kept popping up. Why aren't the Chinese responding in Hong Kong? Yeah. Why have they got tens of thousands of paramilitary police and special forces sitting in camps, apparently unwilling to even exercise close to the border, just sitting? So to me, there's enough evidence there to suggest that those early comments that the virus originated in a guano mine, where the bats were still kind of pooing virus, and that the guys who died from that are the original people, and that that's the virus that was taken to Wuhan, and that scared the CCP enough to put its control mechanism for the population into quarantine.
Yeah,
that seems fairly likely to me.
Yeah, I still think that, everything that we were talking about in Canberra at that time, which was in October of 2019, suggests that perhaps the kickoff point for the virus may have been at least 3, maybe 4 months earlier.
Yeah, late September, first week of October.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, because the PLA is, and this is something that many people don't really quite get their head wrapped around. They look at the People's Liberation Army and they think that it's a traditional army and it's designed specifically to fight other states. The entire PLAN and PLA and PLAAF, the 3 services of the Chinese armed forces, are primarily there to keep the regime in place. It's not a traditional state-on-state warfighting capability. If there's a problem with the regime, if the regime can't move, then the entire structure falls apart, and that's why the Chinese military is so enmeshed with how the Politburo functions and continues. So yeah, I mean, yeah, they got some problems. They really do.
I wanted to jump in because there are some assessments which actually sort of point to the opposite to a certain extent. And that is basically that China, after the initial basically 4 to 8 weeks of complete panic, that was evident here, for example, in Australia, with these PPE, you can say mass purchase rounds by companies which had these basically strong links to the United Front, and shipping them by the plane load to Wuhan. That indicated that there was a moment of panic, a moment of insecurity, a moment of where the regime actually was potentially really feeling under threat. But it could have been that their way of managing it was successful to the point that then basically a new narrative in the information domain basically came to be evident, and that was basically, we are the only ones who can deal with it. We have this basic evidence. We have actually just posting, for example, in social media like Twitter, look at our basically how we open our country, how we basically move millions of people again on holiday basic destinations. But on the other hand, basically, that China realized how the virus can be managed, and very much like rolling lockdowns when need be, because the virus pops up from the north to the south. We just had now a report again in the south. But the thing is that they were able to basically return to a type of managed status quo, while the whole world, especially Europe, was locking down completely with significant economic and now social, basically, you can say, repercussions. Because if you look at the sort of the big China strategic basic plan, that is exactly what you need. You need a weakened West where, for example, less is available for defense, a weakened West where it's less available, for example, to contribute to a type of Marshall Plan, countering, for example, the COVID devastation in Africa and in the Asia Pacific, which then can be exploited, and what is being exploited by the Chinese as part of the Belt Road Initiative, which now is even tied to their vaccine diplomacy. So basically, you take our vaccine, then you have to take the Belt Road. So this is the weaponization we are looking at. So while we are basically panicking and locking everything down Victoria style, we very much might see an opponent having understood that this can be managed with rolling lockdowns, that the overall fatality is much lower than, for example, anticipate. And while we basically destroy ourselves economically, they basically are able not to continue as before, but to continue still at a solid and healthy level. That could also be an alternative view.
Sascha, what really bothers me about all of this at this point in time is that the scientific community itself at least from a Western perspective, isn't really speaking with one voice here. You know, it's kind of like when you talk about other issues that are involving the scientific community, you ask a group of scientists, you'll have a number of different ideas or theories about whatever the topic happens to be, whether it be climate change or even COVID. But you would think that with all the technology at our disposal at the moment, we would know what a manufactured virus would look like from a zoonotic natural virus that came out of some bat's guano, right? I mean, it bothers me that we don't know that. And even if we knew it, that we don't have a structured narrative to educate people in terms of where this is coming from. Because you see, if we don't get on top of this virus, you know, of course, we're going to have future viruses, and we're going to be, you know, just as technically baffled by that as well. It doesn't really, you know, give you a great deal of confidence in our capacity to work these things out, really, does it?
I think one of the main basis of issues here is the extent that the WHO has been captured by China. And not only basically the WHO, also basically very renowned and established basically researchers. Maybe we have to go back and really ask ourselves, how would that fit into the Chinese basic strategic approach? And the Chinese have one approach, which is basically what we call strategic preconditioning, which is very much based on the unrestricted warfare concept. And if you break that down, how that takes place, it is a combination of intentional, multidimensional, integrated use of different instruments, diplomacy, power, investment, technology. From military point of view, Dimerfield, for example. And then obviously we have the free warfare as the information basically, you can say, element. But why do I say that now? Because one of these basic sort of, you can say, adoption of the unrestricted warfare approach is the capturing of international organizations. 5 of the main UN bodies now basically being either run or by people who basically are close to the CCP. And that is for me the important thing, because that is basically how we sort of dictate the narrative. So it is this combination of the actual act, that is the unrestricted warfare approach of capturing organization. And then as part, a subcategory of this approach is basically free warfare, which takes place in the information domain. And that is where the confusion comes from. There is where the lack basically of, you can say, a comprehensive global approach comes from. And do not forget, Australia became the victim of China's economic warfare and aggression because it called already, I think it was in May last year, or was it in June, for basically an independent inquiry. And that is really what hurt the nerve. So that is where I come from and say, this, after this initial basically 2 months of panic, was then actually used by the strategic thinkers as basically, this could actually work in our favor.
Yeah. David?
I think a key thing here, and most people don't understand this because the Chinese economic system confuses so many people. The market apparently makes money, but most mid-tier Chinese banks are essentially bankrupt. They've got so much bad debt they should go under. But of course, they can't go under because the state props them up. So I think the great advantage the Chinese had is the minute they realized that through their version of containment, which is literally lock the city down, immaterial of the consequences, they knew how to pump money in and to keep priming the economy. And the more that fear gripped the rest of the world, the more that allowed them to have an economic recovery. So strategically, whether they started off wanting to use this strategically or not, they were very well positioned to very quickly use it strategically. Whereas it seems, the West really hasn't thought strategically for decades. So we're now seeing the difference between a culture where strategy is highly valued and cultivated, and one that has basically been living in a tactical world of, whack-a-mole as we try and kill terrorists since 9/11. So it's such a clash of two different ways of understanding the great game. One side is entirely tactical, while the other side is entirely strategic.
Good point. I agree. I agree. That sums it up, and that is where we basically lost in the West. We are now slowly starting to respond. Yeah, I'll give you another example, which basically sort of highlights that lawfare, which is one of the basically elements of the three warfares. It was the Chinese first, the PLA, which had a dedicated lawfare group. We see it now in the United States, companies which under the Trump administration were barred, for example, and that has been challenged successfully. That is lawfare, and that is thinking ahead, generations ahead, so to speak. And while we are catching up, there were military thinkers and there were basically writers, and they said this is also happening, and we see that happening. And the Chinese view of the nation, the Chinese nation as a concept, that's something what, for example, President Xi basically coined. The Chinese nation, that means the Chinese abroad are still part of the motherland, completely new concept. That is all what we have noted. But we, because of who we are, living in a globalized world, rule of law, we're talking the Western world, a certain, you can say, naivety is in there, and a belief in the goodness of the adversary. We have completely basically overlooked that to actually sort of reflect on that. And I think it's quite good to see how NATO, for example, slowly moved now into recognizing that China is a serious competitor and even potential adversary. In 2017, it was a focus on Russia. That was basically all post 2014 Crimea, and then 2015 Stoltenberg saying that basically here, hybrid war, and that is what the Russians are doing. But now, since 2017, it is clear we have woken up to it. But obviously, I think, and we see that here now in Europe with the comprehensive agreement on investment, and what the debacle that was, there is this complete disconnect between basically what the political elites want, driven by economic interest, business interest, etc., and then basically what the military thinkers, what the strategists actually say, what is necessary.
So, the recent fracas with regard to bringing up the whole Wuhan lab thing came about as a consequence of two recent articles in the Wall Street Journal in May. And, of course, the speculation had it that 3 staff members of the Wuhan Institute of Virology got sick and were hospitalized around November 2019. I mean, how will we ever know, Sascha? How will we ever know? I mean, it sounds great, it comes from the Wall Street Journal. That's obviously, a credible news source. But of course, now all news sources are up for grabs, social and broadcast. And, depending on who's whispering in whose ear, we get whatever truth is put out there. And of course, when I say truth, I mean truth as in parentheses truth, not an actual truth. So, what happens from this point in time, do you think?
I think personally, in the end, we will never be able to establish that. It is just because that is such a smoking gun. It is basically, if we think of the ramifications of that, under international law, China would be liable for an international wrongful act. That would basically be not working as quick and as basically close as possible already, basically from autumn 2019 with the WHO, with basically a CDC counterparts, etc., and really say we have here something in our hands, which is basically could become the pandemic of the 21st century. And that this omission when you have a duty to act, because under WHO rules, you have a duty to inform, you have a duty to cooperate, you have a duty to provide samples, etc., and access to all the basic lab data, etc., by the way, which was, according to some reports, actually cleaned some of the, I would say, data. But the thing is, for me, that would basically open, that would open basically the box of the Pandora in terms of state and individual liability. Americans have the possibility, for example, using American federal laws, for example, to go after, for example, when it comes to COVID-19 pandemic, to actually go for civil damages. That means like tort or delict. And under international law is very much tort and delict as well. That is the box of the Pandora. If you look at the costs which are associated with the COVID, I'm not talking the UN cost, I'm talking now just the economic cost. If you look at the deficit that Britain has, the deficit that Australia has, and now we can actually claim that as damages. That is the end of the Chinese rejuvenation as President Xi basically dreams. So that is a smoking gun. Apart from that, it will completely destroy the Chinese basic narrative, basically Chinese soft power. Think of the African Union. The African Union has become basically China's, you can say, playground because of basically the minerals, because of the rare earths, getting rid of the Australian market, going out and getting it directly from there. And this one basic narrative that the Chinese have since basically the 70s, always sort of, you can say, continue to basically spin on this narrative, was always like, we are a friend of you, the oppressed, the colonial, the oppressed, etc. nations. We are going to step in, we are a real friend, we will support you with weapons and now with infrastructure. And the devastation if in Africa, we haven't even started talking about that. We're talking about countries like South Africa going into the third lockdown, a country which will suffer such a menace, which leads to social unrest, which leads to crime, you name it. And if suddenly it is established that that comes from there and that it could have been contained, instead of basically allowing flights out of Wuhan while locking down Wuhan, the mood in Africa is at the moment very divided, and young people who basically read the news are very critical of China. So if we have now an independent commission and an inquiry, and we find that this happened, that is the end as we know it now of China's influence, and it will take them decades to come back. So that is the smoking gun, and that's why I don't expect any basically findings which will be recognized globally, because how do you recognize it globally? That means through a UN body. And there comes again the power play, the strategic competition which we mentioned, the capturing of basically key bodies, and the Chinese influence able to stop that. So that is, in my opinion, it will be established basically on circumstantial evidence, including now the Fauci emails, but it will never basically be universally recognized for the reasons which I just mentioned.
You know, we did this report funded by the Department of Defense on the Indo-Pacific. And of course, you know, David and myself are co-authors of this report. And, you know, our broader view of the Indo-Pacific included East Africa. So that would sort of go from South Africa all the way up to Egypt, really, if you wanted to be technical about it. My own recollection, having been in Addis Ababa in 2012, before the new African Union building had been built in Addis, I was sitting on the balcony with a friend of mine who has been on our podcast a couple of times, Sandy Wade, and in his former guise as defense attaché of the European Union posted to the African Union. He said, "Look, John, look at this building over here." And I mean, you couldn't miss it. It looked like a wrecked alien spacecraft in the middle of Addis, you know, because Addis is a traditional African city. This is the tallest building in what could be considered, you know, not a particularly, not an urban space with a lot of tall buildings, shall we say, right? And he says, you know, the Chinese have bought the African Union. They have effectively built this building with, I think it was costed at about $200 million, you know. And he says to me with a wry smile, Sandy says, well, you know what, John, I wouldn't want to be anywhere inside there having a conversation with anyone because all of those rooms are going to be wired to the max. It's interesting that you say this thing could actually pull the pin on, COVID-19 could pull the pin on Chinese influence in Africa. you'd be also aware, Sasha, that the local Africans are developing quite a sophisticated way of playing one group off against the other. And they've been doing this with the Chinese for some time. They don't mind the untied aid. Bring it on, they say. And then, of course, they have their pushback by saying, well, there are conditions, of course. The conditions are you're going to have to employ Africans. We don't want to have Chinese engineers. There are these kind of games that are being played out. It would be interesting to see whether the COVID-19, if it were to get to some form of investigation that is semi-credible and it unrolls basically Chinese influence in Africa, it will have an enormous effect. But my question to you would be that, well, of course, that would create a vacuum. Chinese influence is rolled back, and who's going to move in? The Europeans aren't going to, because they've still got their black arm view of history, haven't they?
I think we have to here also distinguish a little bit. I mean, when you cite African Union member states basically sort of trying to play multiple sides. I mean, I think we have to distinguish here. Here we're talking about political elites. Some of them, where you have a president basically with, 20, 30 years on the clock, so to speak, and very much like a president for life. The thing is that what exactly did we see in Africa? For example, World Bank lending, or for example, European Union investment and infrastructure projects, etc. They always have a human rights clause, and these human rights clauses are obviously which can be troublesome for example, a regime in that region, which, for example, like Zimbabwe, doesn't have the rule of law, doesn't have democracy. And then obviously China comes in and saying, no questions asked. We see that as part of your sovereignty, and we don't want to meddle in internal affairs. So it's basically cheap money or investment basically on the cheap without any basic sort of caveats attached or strings attached. And that is obviously why that is so, I would say, there's such a good business proposal which you cannot pass. But that does not mean that on the ground, the majority of especially younger people, more and more also educated people, don't see what is happening on the ground. But I think we have to also go back into this how basically this whole narrative was spun by the CCP as part of the information warfare approach. And that obviously would be completely strong. I mean, China basically as the only country that can manage it. China as the only country which actually has a positive GDP. China as the country basically which now has the vaccine, Sinopharm, and Sinovac basically, which is so efficient. And we know it's not. That why we have, for example, in Brazil and other states which have taken on board this basically, we have now the reinfection rate going up. We have seen now a Middle Eastern state ordering basically all its citizens to be vaccinated again, but this time with Pfizer. So we're really talking here about the narrative of China as the benefactor that would be completely basically undermined. It would be comparable a little bit to somebody who basically starts a fire and then tries to basically extinguish the fire. And we know from criminal law that that doesn't basically remove the culpability of the person who started the fire. So I think this smoking gun element is very important.
Tim.
I've got to ask a question because it comes up in psychology a lot. If we were to, COVID, I guess, as a event has already happened. There's not really a lot we can do about it now in terms of the cat is out of the bag in some sense, right? So, in psychology, you and I know this is a weird analogy, it's a low resolution analogy to make, but in psychology, you would leave that almost as if it doesn't exist. We can't do anything about it now; it's kind of happened. From a devil's advocate position, what would be the political danger drawback to pursuing a kind of independent investigation? What would be, is it in bad faith to pursue the actual origin of COVID any farther?
I think that's a very good question. And if you look at recent criticism of the Australian government for its war talk, we are very much ready to basically actually, in my opinion, to just go back to the pre-status quo. And let's say, let's just rewind the tape 18 months and go back to happiness. But I think so. I think that there could be some sort of inclination to basically stick with a sort of type of minimum damage pro forma investigation, just in order not to basically, because it goes to the core of it. I mean, to be honest with you, one could even argue that it could bring down President Xi. So it goes to the, in my opinion, it goes to basically the foundations of the current basically CCP leadership and regime. And it would actually sort of also, to a certain extent, void all the achievements, think of Hong Kong, etc. And also basically the increased basically status in the region, simply because we look at nations which are completely ravaged and devastated and have to turn to China in order to get help. Think of Cambodia, for example, where the vaccine was directly tied to Belt Road Initiative. So you get the vaccine in exchange for agreeing for basically our Belt Road Initiative projects. So I think so I personally think that an appeasement is very much likely.
If something like that were to happen and effectively the Chinese communications on the matter turned out to be quote unquote true, that I guess that would be kind of bad will. Like what I guess, you know, if there was an independent investigation that effectively found nothing, like I feel like that would still have consequences.
Many ifs, I think, but just going back to that, you can say really anger, and if you go back and follow the media basic coverage of the fallout over this basically joining the US into this independent inquiry, and basically there were I think here in Canberra there was this one sort of quoting basically, not quoting, but basically going back to Brutus stabbing Caesar at 2. It means you, my friend, as well. You do that to me. So I think that to be honest with you, that even if there was an investigation, it would very much I think that the response would be very, very, very what we talk wolf warrior approach, etc. Would actually sort of, that would basically sort of in my opinion stepped up a notch. And then comes the question, how much do you want in terms of collateral? I mean, think of now education as the next sort of sector here, 10 billion worth. So, you know, it is at one stage comes the question, are we willing to basically steer our course? If it's only in regards to an investigation, unless we say investigation is just one of the basic reasons why we steer our course, and we're tied to human rights, we're tied now to the Uyghurs, and we're also tied then, for example, to the Chinese influence in Australia, the work of the United Front, and obviously also the threats to the rule of law in the Indo-Pacific. If we tie it to more, we might be willing to go. But if it's just basically tied to this investigation, I think there might be a chance to basically settle on an investigation which is perhaps less thorough, less independent, and therefore less harmful, so to speak.
David.
Here's another good example of us being tactical while China's being strategic. We're still talking about how did it happen, whereas China's already gone, okay, Belt and Road was starting to smell like a rotten fish long before COVID. Now Belt and Road is starting to look like the Chinese version of a Marshall Plan. And here we are in the West, you know, sort of wasting time on working out what a totalitarian regime did with the virus. Well, we know what they did after the virus was loose. They took strategic advantage. And they're taking strategic advantage every day And while we focus on where did it come from, we are not becoming a strategic player. We're continuing to be tactical and fundamentally incompetent. So, if the Chinese have got their version of a Marshall Plan, the Xi Plan, to suddenly make Belt and Road appealing, and it's not like Belt and Road has to be good. It just has to keep factories functioning in China and keep raw materials flowing in and goods flowing out, so that the growing middle class are so busy trying to lock down wealth that they don't question that whole cities got locked down. Yeah, it's just about maintaining the machine of avarice within China, because we're too stupid or asleep to recognize that's the real game.
Well, I mean, there is that, that's for sure. Although if you look at Pakistan at the moment, it doesn't look like that the China-Pakistan economic corridor is doing particularly well. And, it's a very complex situation, but obviously the Pakistanis themselves have got issues with regard to the nature of Chinese investment. You've got problems in Kazakhstan now. The Kazakhs are pushing back against the Chinese because firstly, they think that the Kazakh authorities, and I believe that it is a dictatorship over there as well, have been putting too many of their eggs in the China basket. So people are now starting to protest. So they're taking to the streets, causing Kazakh authorities a lot of grief, because the Kazakh authorities also know that the Chinese are persecuting Kazakhs that are living in Western China, right with the Uyghurs. So
yeah, but
yes.
China's only got one game to play, and it's going to play that game to win or to break.
Yeah.
It doesn't have that ability to change game now. The investment in building the machine to work the way it does. This is a machine that can do new strange things on the side. Like in 2017, the machine can get a high-level, high-security virus lab. The machine can steal US plans for weapon systems, well, half the plan, build half the device and try and jerry-rig the rest. But that doesn't mean you can change direction in a meaningful way. In a sense, the Chinese chose their path on June the 3rd, 1989, of absolute suppression of anything that was a threat to the party. Tiananmen wasn't about students. It was about two factions of the CCP fighting to the death about the future of the party, which then affected the future of China. And everything since is really just a continuation of the consequences of that fight to the death within the CCP.
I'm going to put a question to everybody here, and that is, to what degree has Australia paid too high a price in our conflict with China, our trade war with China? The fact that Scott Morrison came up and he did declare that, we're going to be championing an international inquiry into the origins of COVID-19. I mean, is it the case of the sheep roaring, or is it a case of having taken way too big a slice of the international pie for a country like Australia to really process? Because, as David was saying, yes, we're tactical, we're not strategic. The Chinese are beating us at the strategic game, and yet we're making all these statements that can be seen to be strategic, but they're not, and we don't have any follow-up. So are we punishing ourselves to a greater degree here?
Wait till the iron ore price drops back to $50 a ton, and next year's budget is a disaster.
Right. Right.
Again, they were playing a 2-year plan. The Chinese would have totally understood that Brazilian iron ore production would have collapsed under COVID because the Chinese vaccines don't work. Thus Brazil's inability to run anything. At the moment, Chinese companies are going, hi, Brazilian companies, do you need large amounts of money and expertise to put your mining industry back together so we can buy exclusively from you? If that's not strategic, and if we're not essentially stupid.
Sasha.
Just coming back to such an investigation, I think there's also another sort of element to it. Why China will obviously oppose that at all costs, and that is basically that we have this very, very strong R&D cooperation between China and Western pharma companies. Very often, Western companies, for example, blocked by ethical guidelines, etc., they actually then outsource and have basically labs in China doing then research, which would, for example, not here be possible in Australia or, for example, Western Europe for ethical and human, basically, for example, so research involving human participation. And here, I think it is a market. I mean, I think in China, we always have to look at, apart from the strategic approach, we also have to look at money talks and how basically sort of the CCP and basically business is interwoven, can't be separated. And I don't have figures now, but I just read a recent report actually of the sheer number of biolabs doing basic research into the worst possible, basically, you can say, viruses, including Ebola, you name it. And that is basically also a money machine. And now to basically have an international investigation finding that this Wuhan lab was a catastrophe is obviously not good for business. And what's not good for business is basically limiting the Chinese rejuvenation. So yeah, it's become apart from the strategic and apart from national pride, it has become a very clear and present danger to basically standing as this sort of innovation hub.
With regard to businesses, and especially here in Australia, but obviously throughout the West now, there's been a lot of talk about trying to find new markets, diversify your marketing base from China elsewhere. But because China has spent the last 20 odd years creating itself as the world's workshop, where do we go? There is no market bigger than China. We can't look at India. I mean, India is going through a catastrophe right now, which will take at least a generation for it to actually sort out. So what next? I mean, the underdeveloped world in Africa and Latin America, they can provide certain, little outlets for us, but certainly we can't replace like with like in the international community. So what do we have here?
Well, you don't have to find the immediate replacement.
Again, iron ore doesn't go off in the ground.
Yeah, but money in the bank is better than not having money in the bank. That's the cold hard fact.
I suppose if you were to look at it purely just on balance of payments like trade accounts and current accounts and things, but we don't actually have to base our economic well-being on our purely our international trade. So
yeah, tell Josh Frydenberg that he'll love you.
I just want to jump in here. I think that is, again, we spoke about how Chinese strategic thinking takes place and how we're short-sighted. We are basically like a peacekeeping force that's got 6 months of rotation. So it's very limited. And here we're talking about basically the next election, what you have to deliver. But I think we should not actually underestimate the African Union. We shouldn't underestimate Africa. Africa is growing in terms of population, 2 billion. It has enormous potential in terms of as a market. That's why China goes in there. Think of telecommunications. Think, for example, every African above the age of 18 having, for example, a mobile phone. That's where Huawei comes in. So the market Africa is booming, and I do not write Africa off at all. I think actually that Africa has a lot of potential in especially the next 2 to 3 decades. While at the same time, China has these problems. That's why they started now with a 3-child per family and all that. And to a certain extent, if you look at the goals which President Xi has set himself, the reunification of Taiwan, for example, that is something what he wants to achieve. And he wants to achieve that because he has got this demographic time bomb. And he knows that India is knocking at the door and that India will overtake them. And India will basically, it's not as organized, but it's a democracy. It's a lot of chaos. But India is the hub for example, when it comes to computer and telecommunications, and so I think actually that a little bit China is comparable to a middle power in Europe before the First World War. Basically, sort of seen a little bit the windows of opportunity closing, 20 more years, and then basically China has the problems based on the demographic, based on the cost of basically the elderly, etc., while not being a developed nation. And that makes it so difficult for them, because if you have a market which is labor intensive, etc., low skill, etc., even there they try obviously to advance it. And now it's sourcing out to Cambodia and sourcing out to Vietnam, basically what they use to basically provide services. But it is really a big problem because they haven't reached yet the threshold which is necessary to, for example, care for our elderly population at this magnitude. So I think China is really between a rock and a hard place. And the next 30 years will see a complete basically change in terms of what China can do unless it really changes in terms of the market, in terms of innovation, in terms of etc. And that is what actually the CCP has been trying to. That's why it's leading, for example, in some certain key industries, etc. That's why it has got the 1,000 talent program, etc., because it had realized that it has to basically really make another quantum leap, 50 years basically in 10 years, in order to basically be there, where, for example, countries like Japan are.
Yeah, look, I will say that it's an interesting thing to think about China 30 years from now. It's also an interesting thing to think about China 10 years from now, or even less. I mean, Xi is not a young man, and we don't know the state of his health. And assuming he's a healthy individual for his age, what is he, 68, something along those lines? We could almost be guaranteed a decade of him running the country, because he is, after all, president for life now. But if things were to fall off the Xi cart, and let's just be hypothetical here for a moment, what will we likely see in the Chinese space? I mean, once Xi is removed from power, for instance, will we see pragmatic communist cadres coming forward to extend an olive branch to the West and we go back to business as usual? Or do we see a crisis in confidence deep within the CCP, which we have to remind our listeners is about 90 million strong, which is far larger than the Australian population? Will that just create the dynamic of a civil war? What will happen? I mean, this is really the thing that we need to be thinking of, really, surely.
I'm honest. There is a lot of academic discussions about that last 2-3 years, including from the Lowell Institute. And will there be a Xi dynasty, or will there be basically other fractions? There's strong competition. Will there be a return basically to the Deng fort, etc.? But I'm not an expert when it comes to the CCP and the internal basic fractions, and that is why I'm not going to go into more detail, because I would actually just referring to what I read somewhere, and this is for me good enough to comment.
David, you want to have a crack?
Yeah, I would not want to hazard a guess about the party not having enough information about which factions still exist or not. For me, the demographic problem is the huge problem. So that if you've got this aging population, the two-child policy, the birth rate has dropped. They've now said that 3 children is okay, but the incentive package has not been released, because it appears at the moment there is not the money to run the incentive package. And if we look at the consequence for Japan of not having population growth, they're potentially going to move to a robotic economy that is okay with a relatively small population. But that changes the perspective on levels of influence outside the country. If we take, say, South Korea as the example of a country that burst forward, where this intense march towards progress and the social pressure to succeed became immense, we have one of the highest suicide rates in the world amongst young, highly educated people. So there's all sorts of social and demographic problems that China is likely to have to face. And whereas, Japan and Korea are struggling to work out what to do with them, at least they're trying to work out what to do with them, having open discussions within democratic systems, meaning that at least people feel they're being listened to and maybe their view is valued and included. Whereas these problems are going to emerge in China in a system that doesn't care and isn't interested.
Yeah. If I can quickly jump in, I agree here. I think it's also worthwhile to just look at what happened over the last 10 years, and especially now in the last 18 months. I think actually where we are now is actually completely, you could say it is exactly the opposite of actually what China needs. Because China needs innovation. And if you think of these startups, for example, in China, take, for example, Alibaba, in the last 18 months, we have seen what happened there. We have seen this basic crackdown by the party on people like the Alibaba CEO. And that is exactly what you don't need. What you need at the moment in order to prepare for the demographic basic challenge, you need actually more of that. more basically what happened between 2000 and 2010. You need a friendly China, a China you can do business with, a China which basically is innovative, a China which basically sort of catches up, and a China basically which has got these enormous amount of startups actually you from the West and from, for example, the African Union, you want to basically work with. And we have seen now the opposite, with the wolf warrior diplomacy, with the war talk, with the basically the nationalistic or the nationalism angle, with the suppression of basic dissent, with the persecution of the Uyghurs, with the crackdown of Hong Kong, with the threats against Taiwan, with the border clashes with India. I'm sorry to say, that is exactly what you don't need if you want to basically form yourself as a modern socialist type of market economy, open for business, and basically being welcome in the world. And it's actually a complete draw and clawback. And I think that is also a generational, basically, sort of, you can say, schism there, which you can actually witness.
I will be very cheeky and say something here. I think we do have an innovative China. It's called Taiwan. But anyway, I'm leaving it there.
Well said.
Thank you. Anyway, chaps, that's a wrap for tonight. My thanks to our special guest, Sascha-Dominik Dov Bachmann, and for being on Strategikon, and my thanks to co-host David Olney and producer Tim Whiffen for being on with us as well. And to our audience, thanks for listening. We hope that you'll join us for our next exciting adventure through the world of geopolitics. Remember that you can subscribe to the audio version of Strategikon through the Ozcast network, iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Spotify. And please like us on the Sage International Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. We appreciate your support. You can also watch our podcasts on video through the Strategikon Raw YouTube channel when they are available, easily accessed by clicking on the link provided on our website. Also, please comment on any of our articles and podcasts through Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and of course on the Sage International site. We welcome any constructive feedback that can help improve our products, and we look forward to engaging with our followers. If you would like to support Strategikon, remember to check out our merch page. We have a wide variety of items to keep the Strategikon listeners satisfied. Until next time, goodbye.